Chapter 1, The Call at 10:07. Tom Green had always believed that hotel rooms existed outside of real life. They were too clean, too careful, too deliberately neutral to belong to anyone in particular. The framed artwork was always forgettable, something abstract or vaguely coastal, and the lighting always just dim enough to suggest comfort without offering it. He had checked in earlier that afternoon, set his bag down on the luggage rack like a person who traveled often enough to have rituals but not enough to enjoy them, and promptly forgotten where he was supposed to be. Now, leaning back against the headboard with his tie loosened and his laptop dimming in his lap, he stared at nothing in particular and tried to remember what day it was. Thursday, he decided. Or possibly Wednesday, pretending to be Thursday. The phone rang. He glanced at it without urgency. Unknown number. Local area code, but that meant very little. Everything meant very little in a hotel room. He considered letting it go to voicemail. Most unknown calls deserve that treatment. But something, some small unplaceable instinct, made him reach for it on the third ring. Hello. There was a pause. Not the fumbling kind, not the kind that came from distraction or poor connection, but the measured pause of someone deciding how to begin. Is this Thomas Green? Tom shifted upright. No one called him Thomas unless they were selling something or delivering bad news. This is he. My name is. The voice identified themselves with practiced clarity, referencing emergency services, speaking in the kind of tone that was both calm and unmistakably serious. Tom listened, at first passively, then with a stillness that began at the base of his spine and worked its way outward until even his breathing felt intrusive. The words arranged themselves slowly. Name, address, passed away in his sleep. Emergency contact. He realized, distantly, that he had stopped blinking. Tom cleared his throat, the sound surprisingly loud in the small room. You said, this evening? Yes, sir. Earlier tonight. The rest unfolded in simple, respectful sentences. There was no drama in it. No confusion. Just the finality of a quiet end and the logistics that follow. Tom answered what he could, confirmed what was needed, and thanked them, because there is something in people that insists on politeness even when the world has tilted fractionally out of place. When the call ended, he remained sitting exactly as he had been, the phone still in his hand. Okay, he said aloud, although there was no one to hear it. He set the phone down very carefully on the bedside table, as though it might shatter if treated carelessly. Her father. Not just her father. The man who had insisted that parsley was underappreciated. The man who had once spent an entire Sunday explaining composting systems with the enthusiasm of someone discussing a life-changing revelation. The man who had looked at Tom, early in his marriage, and said with complete sincerity, you seem like you'll either be very good for her or very bad. I'm hoping for the first one. Tom exhaled slowly. They had ended things well, as far as such endings could be considered well. No shouting matches, no betrayal, no dramatic unraveling. Just two people standing on opposite sides of a widening distance, both recognizing that wanting something to work did not necessarily make it workable. He hadn't blamed her. He still didn't. Timing, he had told himself then. Timing was a thing people underestimated until it became the only thing that mattered. And somehow, in the quiet aftermath of that ending, her father had remained. Not out of obligation. Not out of some lingering tie he couldn't sever. It had simply made sense. The older man had been alone long before Tom had entered the picture, and Tom had understood, instinctively, that not all connections were meant to be discarded when circumstances changed. He checked the time. 10:07 p.m. too late, under normal circumstances. Not tonight. He hesitated only briefly before picking up the phone again, scrolling through contacts he hadn't needed for months, then longer than that. Her name appeared exactly where it always had, unchanged, unremarkable, waiting. He pressed call. 1 ring. 2. On the third, she answered. Hello. Her voice was the same. It struck him immediately, more than anything else might have. Familiar without being expected, close without being present. Hey, he said, before he had decided how he meant to sound. Pause followed, shorter this time. Tom? She asked, and there was something in it. Surprise, yes, but not discomfort. Not distance, either. Yeah. Hi. Hi. Another pause. Then, gently, is everything okay? He closed his eyes briefly. There was no good way to do this. Are you sitting down? He asked. A small shift in tone. Alertness. Tom. What's going on? Just, can you sit down? He heard movement on the other end. A chair, perhaps. The quiet rustle of someone bracing without knowing why. I'm sitting. He exhaled once, steadying himself not for his sake, but for hers. I got a call tonight, he began. From emergency services. Silence. They said your dad passed away. Earlier this evening. In his sleep. There it was. Said. Real. For a moment, there was nothing from her side of the line. No intake of breath, no immediate reaction. Just an absence that stretched long enough for Tom to wonder if the call had dropped. Then, very quietly, okay. He waited. She stopped, then tried again. Did they say if it was peaceful? They did, Tom said gently. They said it looked like he passed in his sleep. No struggle. Nothing sudden. Another pause, but this one held something different. Processing. rather than shock alone. Okay, she repeated. He let the silence exist, not filling it, not rushing past it. She deserved whatever time she needed, even if he was miles away, speaking into the artificial space of a phone call neither of them had wanted to have. Thank you for calling me, she said eventually. Of course. Her voice wavered, but only slightly. I don't know what I'm supposed to do. You don't have to figure that out tonight. He meant that. He held onto it as something solid he could offer. I'm out of town, he continued. But I'll be back in 2 days. You can stay at my place. You remember where the spare key is. Another pause. Are you sure? The question was quiet, careful. Not about logistics. Yes, he said, without hesitation. It was never a question. He heard her exhale, the sound almost fragile. Okay. I'll handle what I can from here, he added. We'll figure the rest out when I'm back. Okay, she said again, though this time it sounded steadier, anchored. He hesitated, then softened his voice. Hey, yeah, I'm here, even if I'm not there yet. The line held that for a moment. I know, she said. When the call ended, Tom remained sitting on the edge of the bed, staring at nothing again. But this time, it wasn't emptiness. It was anticipation of something uncertain, something unresolved. He wasn't sure what he would find when he got home, but he knew one thing with absolute clarity. Whatever it was, they would not face it alone. Chapter 2: The House with the Herb Garden. Tom let himself into his house just after noon 2 days later, the quiet click of the door sounding louder than it should have. Travel had a way of compressing time and stretching it simultaneously. The last 48 hours felt both rushed and heavy, each moment spent with the knowledge of what waited at home. He paused just inside the entryway. Something was different. Not wrong, just inhabited. There was a coat draped over the back of a chair that didn't belong to him. A pair of shoes neatly placed near the door, aligned with a certain unconscious precision he remembered well. The faint smell of coffee lingered, not quite fresh, but not stale either. He exhaled slowly. Hey, he called, not loudly, but enough. There was movement from down the hall, followed by her voice. I'm in the kitchen. Of course she was. The kitchen had always been the center of things, not by design but by gravity. He walked toward it, each step accompanied by a strange mix of familiarity and distance, like retracing a route he hadn't taken in years, but still knew instinctively. She stood by the counter, one hand resting against the edge, the other wrapped loosely around a mug. She looked up when he entered, her expression settling somewhere between relief and uncertainty. Hi, she said. Hi. They held that for a moment, neither moving closer, neither stepping back. You made it back, she added, as though there had been any doubt. I said I would. I know. A small, almost absent nod. It's just different, hearing it and then actually seeing you here. He understood that more than he expected. The difference between intention and presence, between promise and reality. How are you? He asked. She gave a quiet, almost humorless exhale. I don't know yet. She glanced down at her mug, then back up. I keep expecting my phone to ring, and for it to be him asking me to pick up more basil or something. Tom nodded once. Yeah, he said softly. He was very specific about his basil. That earned the faintest hint of a smile. Brief but real. He said the store-bought stuff tasted like disappointment. He wasn't wrong. No, he wasn't. The moment lingered, lightened just enough by memory to make standing in the same room bearable. Tom set his bag down by the wall, shrugging off his jacket. You okay staying here? He asked. Everything working? Yeah. I didn't want to. She gestured vaguely around her. I didn't want to go to his place alone. Not yet. You don't have to, Tom said simply. We'll go when you're ready. She nodded, accepting that without argument. I watered your plants, she added after a beat. I figured you wouldn't want to come home to those dead too. Tom followed her gaze toward the window where a row of modest, well-kept plants sat in uneven but intentional arrangement. I appreciate that, he said. They've survived worse, but still. I also reorganized your cabinet, she continued almost cautiously. Out of habit. He huffed a quiet laugh. Of course you did. You're welcome. I didn't say thank you. You meant it. He did. The rhythm slipped into place without asking permission. Not identical to what it had been, not effortless but recognizable. Like music half remembered, the melody returning before the lyrics. Did you eat? He asked, moving toward the fridge more out of instinct than intention. Sort of, she said. I wasn't that hungry. Tom opened the fridge, surveying its contents with practical detachment. Well, sort of isn't going to hold, he said. We can make something simple. You don't have to. I know I don't have to, he interrupted gently. I'm doing it anyway. She watched him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Okay. He pulled out ingredients without much thought. Pasta, a jar of sauce, vegetables that were still in acceptable condition. The kind of meal that required just enough attention to be grounding, but not enough to be overwhelming. She shifted to stand beside him, not quite helping, but not entirely passive either. You still cut things too big, she observed after a moment, watching him work. They shrink, Tom said, without looking up. They don't shrink that much. They shrink enough. She tilted her head, considering, then reached for a knife. Move. I'm perfectly capable. Tom. He stepped aside. She adjusted the cutting board slightly, then began slicing with efficient precision, each piece uniform in a way that suggested both practice and preference. There, she said after a moment. Consistency. Overrated. Fundamental. He glanced at her, the corner of his mouth lifting despite everything. Still arguing the small things, he said. It was never about the things, she replied just as quickly. That landed. Not heavy, not accusatory, just true. Tom stirred the pot, letting the simple motion fill the space for a moment. No, he said after a beat. It wasn't. They worked in a quieter rhythm after that, the earlier ease softened by something more thoughtful, more aware. His garden's probably a mess, she said eventually, breaking the silence. Tom looked up. Maybe, he said, or maybe it's exactly how he left it. He hates when it gets overgrown. Hated, Tom corrected gently. She flinched just barely. Right, she said. He set down the spoon. We don't have to go today, he offered. Or tomorrow, whenever you're ready. She leaned back against the counter, arms folding loosely. What if I'm not ready for a while? She asked. Then we wait a while. And if things pile up, they'll still be there, Tom said. Nothing in that house is on a schedule except the plants, and even they're more resilient than he gave them credit for. She let out a small breath, her shoulders relaxing incrementally. You always sound so sure of that. I'm not, he admitted. I just figure certainty is useful sometimes. That earned another flicker of a smile. They ate at the small table by the window, the conversation intermittent but comfortable in its gaps. There was no rush to fill every silence, no pressure to navigate every unresolved thread immediately. Afterward, she carried her plate to the sink without being asked. You still rinse before putting things in? She asked. I've evolved. Have you? Marginally. She nodded, accepting that as the highest plausible claim. Later, as the afternoon shifted toward evening, they found themselves on the back porch without having explicitly decided to go there. The air was mild, the kind of quiet spring warmth that encouraged stillness rather than activity. Beyond the porch, the yard stretched modestly, and at its edge, slightly overgrown but undeniably persistent, was the beginning of the herb garden. She stepped closer to the railing, her gaze fixed on it. He'd hate that, she said. Tom followed her line of sight. Yeah, he agreed. He would. They stood there for a moment. Do you think he knew? She asked suddenly. Tom glanced at her. Knew what? That things were going to end, she clarified. Not just with him. With everything. With us. Tom considered that. He knew a lot of things, he said carefully. But he also liked pretending he didn't, when it suited him. She huffed a quiet laugh. That sounds like him. He once told me timing was just regret with better marketing, Tom added. She turned toward him slightly, surprised. He never said that to me. He said it while we were watering the garden, Tom said. Like it was a perfectly normal thing to drop into conversation. That also sounds like him. They stood in the softening light, the weight of the past present but no longer overwhelming. I didn't think I'd be back here like this, she admitted after a while. Neither did I, Tom said. She looked at him then, really looked this time. But I'm glad you are, she said. Tom held her gaze, something steady settling into place beneath everything else. Grief, history, uncertainty. Yeah, he said quietly. Me too. And for the first time since the call, it didn't feel like something they were enduring alone. Chapter 3, Inventory of a Life. The following morning began with a plan neither of them had officially agreed to. Tom found her already awake, seated at the kitchen table with a notepad, and a pen tucked behind her ear like a professional who had clocked in before anyone else. A half-drunk cup of coffee sat nearby, forgotten just enough to suggest she had been staring at the same page for a while. Morning, he said, leaning against the doorway. Morning, she replied without looking up. He stepped closer, glancing at the notepad. You're making a list. I am attempting to make a list, she corrected. Currently, I have written things to do, and then stared at it for 10 minutes. That's a strong start, Tom said. Ambitious. She huffed a quiet breath, finally looking up at him. I don't know where to begin. Tom nodded slowly, pulling out a chair across from her. We don't have to do everything at once, he said. We can just go over there. Take a look. Take a look, she repeated, as though testing the phrasing. No decisions, he added. Just information gathering. She tapped the pen against the paper. You're very good at reframing overwhelming situations into manageable steps. It's either that or sit here all day staring at things to do, Tom said. That is also an option. Not a productive one. She sighed, then set the pen down. Okay, she said. We'll take a look. Her father's house greeted them exactly as it had 100 times before. The front door still stuck slightly at the bottom, requiring a familiar upward lift on the handle. The hallway smelled faintly of dried herbs and something vaguely medicinal, the kind of scent that clung to older homes not out of neglect, but out of long habit. She hesitated just inside the doorway. Tom noticed. "You don't have to go first," he said. She glanced at him, then shook her head. "No," she said quietly. "I should." She stepped forward. The house was still. Not empty, not yet, but paused as though waiting for something to resume. A clock ticked somewhere in the distance, marking time that no longer felt aligned with anything. "He always left that on," she murmured, nodding toward the sound. "Didn't trust silence," Tom said. "He called it suspicious." "That sounds right." They moved slowly through the house, not as intruders, but as careful observers of something that no longer belonged wholly to them but still recognized them anyway. The kitchen was the hardest. Everything remained in place. Jars labeled in his precise, slightly slanted handwriting, bundles of dried herbs hanging near the window. A cutting board still marked with the shallow grooves of consistent use. "He didn't finish cleaning this?" she said softly, touching the edge of the counter. Tom followed her gaze. A knife sat beside the sink, rinsed but not dried, as though he had every intention of returning to it. "He probably thought he'd get to it in the morning," Tom said. She swallowed, nodding once. "Yeah." For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Tom cleared his throat gently. "Information gathering," he reminded her. She exhaled slowly. "Right?" They began with small things, not because they were insignificant, but because they were manageable. A drawer of utensils, a shelf of spices, some expired, some clearly not. A stack of unopened mail. She opened envelopes with careful precision, scanning each one with the detached focus of someone postponing the emotional part of the task. Utilities. Something from the insurance company," she muttered. "Anything urgent?" Tom asked. "Not yet." She set a few aside. "We'll need to notify people eventually." "Eventually is fine," he said. They moved to the living room next. Here, the signs of personality were stronger. Books stacked in deliberate chaos. A worn chair angled toward the window. A small side table cluttered with notes written on whatever scrap paper had been available at the time. Receipts, envelopes, the back of a brochure. Tom picked one up. "What does this say?" he asked. She leaned over, squinting. "Time again." "That's not helpful." "It's very helpful," she said seriously. "It means he ran out of time and needed more. He wrote himself a note to buy something he already bought too much of. He didn't believe in having too much time." Tom smiled faintly. "That sounds like something he'd argue convincingly." "He did," she said. "More than once." They set the note aside, the act simple but oddly deliberate. As they continued, patterns began to emerge. Her father had not been a man of clutter, but he had been a man of layers. For every clearly defined item, there was something tucked behind it, beneath it, or folded inside it. A receipt tucked into a book, a photograph hidden in a drawer, a handwritten list slipped between pages of a manual he had likely not needed. "Did you know he kept these?" Tom asked at one point, holding up a small bundle of photographs. She stepped closer. Old pictures. Not framed, not displayed, just kept. She took them from him, flipping through slowly. "That's from when I was a kid," she said, pausing on one. "He hated taking pictures, but he always kept them." "Selective sentimentality," Tom said. "Exactly." She lingered on one photo a moment longer, then handed them back. "You can keep those," Tom said. She blinked. "Why would I?" "They're yours," he said gently. "Not his anymore." Something in her expression shifted, recognition, maybe, or the first quiet acceptance of what this process actually meant. "Right?" she said. They set the photographs aside more carefully than anything else so far. By early afternoon, the rhythm of the work had changed. They moved more fluidly, less hesitant. Decisions were still tentative, keep, revisit later, donate, but the act of sorting had created its own momentum. At one point, Tom opened a cabinet near the pantry and froze. "What?" she asked, noticing his expression. He reached in slowly and pulled out 3 identical bags. "All time," he said. She stared at them, then laughed. An actual laugh this time, unguarded and bright in a way that startled both of them. "Okay," she said. That's accurate." He absolutely believed this was a reasonable amount. He probably thought it was on sale. "They're all different brands." She leaned against the counter, still smiling. He didn't trust a single source. "That tracks." They stood there for a moment, the absurdity of it softening the edges of everything else. "Do we keep the time?" Tom asked. She considered it seriously. "I don't think we can justify 3 bags of time. We could distribute it strategically." "To who?" "I don't know. Neighbors? People we vaguely owe favors to." She shook her head, still smiling. "Let's keep one. In his honor. A ceremonial time." "Exactly." Tom nodded solemnly. "I can respect that." They set 2 bags aside, keeping one with deliberate intention. As the day wore on, fatigue began to settle in. Not overwhelming, but present. "This is enough for today," Tom said eventually. She didn't argue. "Yeah," she agreed. "It is." They stepped outside into the backyard. the shift from enclosed spaces to open air immediately noticeable. The herb garden lay before them. It had grown past its careful boundaries, creeping outward in places, dense in others. Not wild, exactly, but no longer maintained with the precise attention it had once received. "He'd hate this," she said again, quieter this time. Tom stepped closer, crouching to inspect one section. "Or," he said, brushing his fingers lightly over the leaves, "he'd say it was finding its own direction." She smiled faintly. He did like saying that when things got out of control. It made it sound intentional. She moved beside him, looking down at the garden. "Do you think we should try to fix it?" she asked. Tom considered the question, then shook his head slightly. "Not today," he said. "Today we just look at it." She nodded. "Just look at it," she echoed. They stood there side by side, the late afternoon sun casting long shadows across the uneven rows. "This feels strange," she admitted after a moment. "Yeah. Not bad," she added. "Just unfamiliar." Tom glanced at her. "Unfamiliar isn't always a bad place to start," he said. She met his gaze, something thoughtful settling there. "No," she said. "I guess it isn't." For a while longer they stayed like that, quiet, observational, present. Not trying to solve everything. Not trying to define what came next. Just standing in the space between what had been and what might still be, with the faint, persistent scent of time lingering in the air. Chapter 4: The Things Left Unsaid. That evening settled into the house more quietly than the ones before. There was dinner, simple again, and conversation that came in measured intervals. Not strained, not forced, but deliberate in a way that suggested both of them were aware of something approaching, something yet unspoken. It was later, when the dishes had been cleared and the house had drifted into the kind of stillness that came after a long day, that the conversation finally shifted. They found themselves in the living room, the overhead light off, a lamp casting a warm circle that softened the edges of everything. She sat curled at one end of the couch, her feet tucked beneath her, while Tom leaned back in the chair across from her, one ankle resting on his opposite knee. For a while, they occupied the same quiet without needing to fill it. Then she spoke. "Do you remember when we first talked about moving?" she asked, not looking at him. Tom considered. "Which time?" he asked lightly. "We had several versions of that conversation. The first real one," she clarified. "When it stopped being hypothetical." He nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said. "Your promotion was, what, 2 weeks out from being finalized?" 10 days, she said immediately. "I remember because I counted them like they were something I could control." "That sounds about right." She rubbed her thumb along the edge of the couch cushion, tracing an invisible line. "I thought if I had enough time to think about it, I'd figure out how to make it work." Tom watched her carefully. "And did you?" he asked. She let out a quiet breath, the sound somewhere between a laugh and an exhale of disbelief. "No," she said. "I just got really good at pretending it wasn't already a problem." He nodded, absorbing that. "I remember you asking me if I'd consider transferring," she continued, like it was a normal question that didn't come with everything else. "It was a normal question," Tom said, "just with complicated answers." "Your answers were always thoughtful," she said, glancing at him briefly. "Mine were faster." "You had less time to work with," he said. "That's generous." "It's accurate." She shifted slightly, turning more toward him now, her expression thoughtful rather than guarded. "I think I knew," she admitted. "Even then. Not fully, but enough. That if one of us compromised too much, it wouldn't last anyway." Tom leaned back a little further, considering her words. "Probably," he said. "Resentment's a slow burn. People don't notice it until it's already got momentum." She nodded once. "And I didn't want to resent you," she said. "Or the opportunity." "You didn't," Tom replied. "You made a decision." "That sounds very clean when you say it like that." "It was messy," he said. "Just not destructive." That earned a faint, appreciative smile. "Is that how you think of it?" she asked. "Not destructive?" Tom paused, not answering immediately. "Yeah," he said finally. "I do. Even now. Especially now." She studied him for a moment, as though trying to measure the distance between what he said and what he felt. "I always wondered," she said slowly, "if you were angrier than you let on." Tom tilted his head slightly. "What would that have changed?" he asked. "I don't know," she admitted. "Maybe I just expected it, or thought I deserved it." "You didn't," he said simply. She held his gaze, something searching in her expression. "Not even a little?" Tom considered the question honestly. "I was angry," he said. "Just not at you." "Then at what?" He let out a small breath, his fingers tapping lightly against the armrest. "At timing," he said. "At circumstances. At the fact that things lined up in a way that made sense on paper and fell apart in practice." She exhaled slowly, something in her shoulders easing. "That's exactly how it felt," she said. "Like everything was technically correct, but not workable." "Yeah." They fell into another brief silence, but this time it wasn't avoidance. It was assimilation, each of them turning over what had been said, fitting it into the broader shape of their shared history. I loved you, she said after a moment, her voice steady. Tom didn't react immediately, not because he hadn't heard, but because he had. I know, he said. I really did, she continued, the words quiet but deliberate. I wasn't leaving because that changed. I know, he repeated, just as steady. She tilted her head slightly, studying him again. You always said that, she said. Even then, like it was obvious. It was, Tom said. To you, maybe. To me, he agreed. And that was enough at the time. She leaned back against the couch, exhaling slowly. I think I thought love was supposed to fix things, she admitted. Tom smiled faintly. It would be convenient if it did, he said. But it mostly just makes the problems more noticeable. That's not very romantic. It's accurate. It is, she conceded. The conversation shifted then, not dramatically but inevitably. What about now? She asked. Tom frowned slightly. What about now? He echoed. She hesitated, not pulling the question back, but shaping it more carefully. Do you still think about it? She asked. About us. Tom didn't look away. Yeah, he said. Just sometimes? She pressed. Depends on the day, he replied. Sometimes it's a passing thought. Sometimes it's. He shrugged lightly. More than that. She nodded, absorbing that. I didn't at first, she said. After everything. I threw myself into work like it was the obvious answer. That tracks, Tom said gently. It worked too, she added. For a while. And then it didn't, she said simply. Tom's expression didn't change, but something in his posture shifted, attention sharpening. When did that happen? He asked. She thought about it. I don't know the exact moment, she admitted. It wasn't dramatic, just gradual, like realizing you're in a room you chose, but you're not sure why you're still there. He leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees. And did you figure out the why? He asked. She met his gaze. Partly, she said. It was a good opportunity. It still is. But I think I stopped asking if it was the right one long term. Tom nodded thoughtfully. That's an easy question to postpone, he said. It is, she agreed. Especially when everything else around you reinforces it. And now you're asking it again. Now I don't have a reason not to. That settled between them, not heavy, but significant. Tom leaned back again, letting out a slow breath. That's a lot to think through, he said. It is, she agreed. I'm not trying to figure it out all at once. Good, he said. Because that's usually when people make the worst decisions. She smiled faintly at that. Still pragmatic. Still realistic. I used to think those were the same thing, she said. And now I think pragmatic is about what works right now, she said slowly. Realistic is about what works eventually. Tom raised an eyebrow. That's a distinction. It is, she said. I didn't understand it before. He considered that. I think you did, he said. You just made the best choice you could with the information you had. She looked at him, something softer in her expression now. You're very fair about all of this, she observed. Tom shrugged slightly. Fair is easier than bitter, he said. It takes less energy. She laughed quietly. That sounds like something my dad would have said. He would have approved, Tom agreed. She fell quiet again, but this time her gaze lingered on him a little longer. You know, she said, he liked you more after the divorce. Tom blinked. That feels backwards. He said you stayed, she explained. That told him more than anything else. Tom looked away briefly, absorbing that in a way he hadn't expected to. He was a good judge of character, Tom said after a moment. He was, she agreed. The room settled again, but not in silence this time, in something closer to understanding. Not everything was resolved. Not everything needed to be. But for the first time, they weren't just revisiting the past. They were examining it. And somewhere within that, quietly and without announcement, something that had once ended began to feel less finished. Chapter 5. The funeral that was almost a comedy. The morning of the funeral began with rain that couldn't quite commit. It hovered somewhere between mist and drizzle, the sky undecided, as though even the weather found the situation too definite to fully agree with. Tom stood by the front window with a cup of coffee he hadn't touched, watching droplets gather and fall without urgency. Behind him, she adjusted the sleeve of her black dress for the third time in as many minutes. Do I look like I'm trying too hard to look appropriate? She asked. Tom turned, considering her with a level of seriousness that suggested the question deserved it. You look like you thought about it and then chose something anyway, he said. She frowned slightly. That sounds like a diplomatic answer. It is, he agreed. Can you make it less diplomatic? He tilted his head. You look good, he said simply. And appropriate. She exhaled, tension easing just a fraction. Okay, she said. I'll take that. Tom glanced down at his own suit jacket, smoothing an imaginary crease. I feel like I'm wearing something I borrowed from a version of myself that attends more formal events, he admitted. You wore that to our wedding, she said. He paused. Well, he said after a beat. That explains why it feels significant. She almost smiled. That also explains why it fits, she added. I haven't changed that much. That's debatable. He raised an eyebrow. Careful. Sorry, she said, not sounding particularly apologetic. It's a stressful day. I'm reverting to familiar patterns. Mocking me is comforting? It's grounding. He nodded thoughtfully. I'm glad I can provide stability in your time of need. She let out a quiet laugh, then sobered slightly. Thank you, she said, more sincerely this time, for being here. Tom didn't deflect that. Of course, he said. The funeral home had the same carefully curated atmosphere all such places shared. Neutral tones, soft lighting, chairs arranged in neat rows that implied structure without demanding it. People gathered in small clusters, their voices low, their expressions a mix of somber respect and mild social uncertainty. Tom stayed close to her without hovering, a presence rather than a shield. She greeted people with polite familiarity. Neighbors, a former coworker of her father's, someone who claimed to have once borrowed a ladder and never returned it. That sounds like him, she said automatically, then blinked as though realizing what she'd said. Tom leaned slightly toward her. We should check the garage, he murmured. He might have documented it somewhere. That earned the smallest corner of a smile. The service itself began without ceremony beyond the expected. A speaker stood at the front, clearing their throat slightly before starting. Your father wrote some notes, the officiant announced. He left instructions, actually, regarding how he wanted today to go. Tom felt her straighten beside him. That feels dangerous, she murmured under her breath. I'm cautiously optimistic, Tom replied. The officiant unfolded a piece of paper, glancing down at it with an expression that shifted, just barely, from professional neutrality to something closer to restrained amusement. He asked me to begin by saying, and I quote, the officiant began, if this is overly sad, you've misunderstood the assignment. There was a pause. Then, unexpectedly, a small ripple of laughter moved through the room. Quiet, hesitant, but real. She let out a surprised breath. That sounds exactly like him, she whispered. Tom nodded. He's still setting the tone, he said. The officiant continued. He also specified that anyone giving a speech should keep it under 5 minutes unless it's particularly entertaining, and that there should be at least one anecdote involving a mistake he made that turned out not to matter in the long run. Tom leaned slightly closer. That's a very specific guideline, he said softly. He was efficient, she replied. The first speaker approached, a neighbor who seemed both honored and mildly unprepared. They began with a standard reflection, voice wavering slightly, before settling into something more natural. Your father once tried to convince me that rosemary could solve more problems than most people, the neighbor said. I didn't believe him until he fixed my tomato plants with it somehow. That's not how that works, Tom whispered. She shook her head. He made it work. The speech continued, weaving through small memories that painted a fuller picture than either of them had expected. More speakers followed. A former colleague who described her father as stubborn in a way that was occasionally useful. A neighbor who admitted to arguing with him over the proper way to store herbs. An old friend who recounted a story that began as a disaster involving a broken fence and ended in a shared meal that lasted 6 hours. At one point, a man stepped up who neither Tom nor she immediately recognized. I was the guy who returned the ladder, he said simply. 10 years later. The room laughed again, louder this time. He kept track, the man added. Not in a vindictive way, more like a curious one. That feels accurate, Tom said quietly. She nodded. Throughout it all, something shifted. The grief didn't disappear. Not even close, but it expanded, making room for something lighter, something that didn't feel like it was betraying the moment by existing. When it was her turn, she hesitated only briefly before standing. Tom watched as she made her way to the front, her posture steady but her hands just slightly clasped together. I didn't prepare anything, she began, her voice clear but softer than usual, which I think he would have preferred, because he didn't trust notes. A faint murmur of agreement. He liked things to feel immediate, she continued. Like you were saying them because you meant them right then, not because you wrote them down earlier. She paused, taking a breath. My dad was a lot of things, she said. He was specific, about herbs, about routines, about what counted as worth worrying about and what didn't. Another small pause. He told me once that most problems look permanent when you're standing too close to them, she went on, and that if you step back even a little, they usually turn into something you can work with. Tom felt that settle somewhere deeper than he expected. He didn't always follow his own advice, she added with a faint, knowing smile. But he believed it, and somehow that made it easier to believe too. Her voice steadied further. I think he would want today to feel like that, she said. Not like something final, but something that we can work with, in whatever comes next. She stepped back, the room quiet in a way that felt full rather than heavy. When she returned to her seat, she exhaled slowly, her hand resting briefly against the chair before she sat. That was good, Tom said quietly. I didn't say anything profound, she replied. You didn't have to. She glanced at him, something unreadable but warm flickering behind her eyes. The service ended not in silence, but in conversation. People lingered, sharing memories, repeating small stories that grew slightly with each telling. There was food laid out in an adjacent room, simple, understated, exactly the kind of thing her father would have approved of. Tom found himself pulled into a conversation about composting that he did not start but somehow understood enough to contribute to. He would have liked this, he said to her at one point, gesturing subtly toward the gathering. She followed his gaze. Yeah, she said. He would have. There was a pause. Then she added quieter. I didn't think I'd be able to get through today. You didn't, Tom said lightly. We did. She turned toward him. We did, she repeated. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No sudden realization, no overwhelming shift. Just a quiet acknowledgement that, once again, they had moved through something difficult together and come out the other side not diminished, but closer. Even if neither of them had said it yet. Chapter 6. After everyone leaves, the house felt different after the funeral. Not emptier because it had always been just the two of them there, but quieter in a way that carried weight instead of space. The kind of quiet that followed something significant, when the energy of people and conversation had dissolved, leaving only what remained. Tom noticed it first when they stepped back inside, both of them pausing instinctively in the entryway as though expecting something to meet them there. Well, he said after a moment, setting his keys down. We survived that. She let out a small breath, slipping off her shoes. Barely, she replied. But yeah, we did. They moved through the house without urgency, the earlier need to fill time or manage tasks replaced by something slower, more deliberate. Neither of them suggested dinner right away. Instead, she wandered to the window, fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the curtain, while Tom drifted toward the kitchen, opening and closing the fridge without real intention. After a minute, he looked over his shoulder. We should probably eat something, he said. Probably, she agreed, though she didn't move. You want anything specific? No, she said. Then, after a pause, something uncomplicated. Tom nodded. Uncomplicated is doable. He began assembling something basic again. Sandwiches this time, working with quiet efficiency while she remained by the window, her reflection faintly visible in the glass. You were good today, he said after a moment. She glanced back at him. At the funeral, he clarified. You handled it well. I don't know if handled is the right word, she said. I just got through it. That counts. She considered that, then nodded slightly. Yeah, she said. I guess it does. They ate at the table with the same easy silence that had begun to define their time together. Not empty, not awkward, but shared. Afterward, she lingered in her seat, tracing the rim of her glass with her fingertip. What happens now? She asked. Tom leaned back slightly, considering the question. In terms of, he prompted. She gestured vaguely. Everything, she said. His house, my job, this. She motioned lightly between them. Tom didn't rush to answer. Well, he said after a moment. His house we can take step by step. There's no deadline on remembering someone. She nodded, accepting that part. And your job? He continued. That's more immediate. She exhaled slowly. I have a flight in 4 days, she said. I'm supposed to go back and pick up where I left off. And are you going to? Tom asked. She hesitated. I don't know, she admitted. That hung there, more significant than anything she had said so far. Tom leaned forward slightly, resting his arms on the table. Is that because you don't want to go back? He asked carefully. Or because you don't want to decide yet? She thought about that longer. Both, she said finally. He nodded. That's fair. I used to be so sure about it, she continued. About what I wanted. About where I was headed. It all felt very clear. And now it doesn't, he said. No, she said. Now it feels like I was following a plan I didn't question. And suddenly I have time to question it. Tom tilted his head slightly. Time can do that, he said. She gave a faint, humorless smile. Turns out, I'm not as good with open-ended decisions as I thought I was. You don't have to decide everything at once, Tom said. You didn't last time either. She looked up at him. That's not exactly comforting, she said. It's not meant to be comforting, he replied. It's meant to be accurate. She studied him for a moment, then leaned back slightly. You've changed, she said. Tom raised an eyebrow. In what way? You're more direct, she said. Less careful about softening things. He considered that. Maybe, he said. Or maybe there's just less reason to avoid things now. She nodded slowly. That makes sense. There was a pause, and then she shifted slightly in her seat, her expression becoming more focused. And what about this? She asked again, quieter this time. Tom knew what she meant without needing clarification. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he stood, collecting their plates and carrying them to the sink, giving himself a moment to think, not to avoid but to be deliberate. When he turned back, he didn't sit down again. I was thinking the same thing, he said. She watched him carefully. And? She pressed. And I don't think it makes sense to ignore it, he said. Whatever this is. Her gaze didn't waver. No, she said. It doesn't. Tom leaned lightly against the counter, hands resting at his sides. But I also don't think we should rush it into something just because it's familiar, he continued. She nodded once. I agree, she said. There was no hesitation in that. That didn't work the last time, she added. No, he said. It didn't. They stood there, not across from each other but at an angle, the space between them smaller than it had been days ago, but not yet fully closed. I don't want to make the same decision twice for the same reasons, she said after a moment. Tom's expression softened slightly. That's a good approach, he said. And I don't want to avoid it either, she continued. Just because it might be complicated. That's also a good approach. She let out a small breath, almost a laugh. So we agree, she said. We just don't know what that agreement means yet. Exactly, Tom said. There was a pause. Then she looked up at him again. Do you want this to be something? She asked, the question direct but not demanding. Tom held her gaze. Yes, he said. The answer was simple, immediate, certain. She absorbed that, something shifting quietly in her expression. Not surprise, but acknowledgement. Okay, she said softly. And you? He asked. She didn't look away. Yes, she said. The word settled between them. Not heavy, not overwhelming, just clear. Neither of them moved right away. There was no sudden rush, no dramatic gesture to mark the moment. Just the shared understanding that something had been defined, however loosely. We're very calm about this, she noted after a moment. Tom smiled faintly. We've had practice. That's one way to put it. He pushed off from the counter slightly, taking a step closer. Not enough to crowd her, but enough to change the space between them. We'll figure it out, he said. She nodded. I think we will. Another quiet moment passed, but this one felt different. Resolved in a way the earlier ones hadn't been. She glanced toward the back door, toward the faint outline of the yard beyond. The garden's still a mess, she said. Tom followed her gaze. Yeah, he said. She looked back at him. Tomorrow? She suggested. He nodded without hesitation. Tomorrow. It wasn't just about the garden. They both understood that. But it was a place to start. And this time, starting didn't feel like something they had to rush through. It felt like something they could build. Together. Chapter 7, a second attempt at timing. The garden looked worse in the morning light. What had seemed gently overgrown the evening before now revealed itself in full detail. Herbs spilling into one another's spaces. Stems reaching in directions that suggested long neglect rather than quiet independence. It wasn't chaos, exactly, but it had lost the careful intention her father had once insisted on maintaining. She stood at the edge of it, arms crossed loosely, squinting slightly as though studying a problem she might eventually solve. He'd definitely hate this, she said. Tom, standing a step behind her with 2 mugs of coffee in hand, nodded. Yeah, he said. This is beyond finding its own direction. She glanced back at him, accepting one of the mugs. Thank you. Of course. They stood there for a moment in silence, both surveying the space. So, she said finally, where do we even start? Tom took a sip of coffee, considering. Well, he said, we could try to fix everything at once and immediately regret it. Tempting, she replied. Or, he continued, we pick one section and focus on that. She nodded slowly. That sounds more survivable. He gestured toward a cluster near the center. That was time originally. She followed his indication, tilting her head. Originally. It's hard to confirm now, he admitted. But I'm reasonably confident. She stepped closer, crouching slightly to inspect it. It still smells right, she said, brushing her fingers lightly over the leaves. Good sign. You're going to need to be more precise than that, she said, glancing up at him. I can't rebuild a garden on good signs. Tom crouched beside her, setting his mug down on the edge of the stone border. I am offering moral support, he said. Unacceptable, she replied. I need actionable input. Okay. He leaned in slightly, pointing. We clear the edges first. Give it space. She nodded once. That makes sense. And then we figure out what we're keeping versus what's aggressively relocating. She smiled faintly at that. That's a diplomatic way to say, taking over everything. I'm trying to stay respectful. He would appreciate that. They worked in companionable focus, hands moving through the soil, separating, trimming, adjusting. There was something undeniably grounding about the task, physical, immediate, requiring attention but not overthinking. You're pulling too much, she said at one point, reaching over to stop his hand. I am not, he argued. You are, she insisted. That part was fine. It was encroaching. It was existing. That's a generous interpretation. She shook her head, gently repositioning the plant. This is why I used to do this part, she said. I recall you taking over frequently, Tom replied, because you treated it like a negotiation. Everything is negotiable. Not plants. They respond to incentives. She gave him a look. They respond to care, she corrected. Care can be incentivized. Tom. Okay, okay. He raised his hands slightly in surrender. You're in charge of plant relations. Thank you. They continued like that, small disagreements layered with familiarity, the rhythm of working side by side slipping into place more naturally than either of them commented on. After a while, she leaned back on her heels, brushing dirt from her hands. This is actually helping, she admitted. Tom glanced at her. The garden or the arguing? He asked. Both, she said. That tracks. She studied the section they'd worked on. It feels like something we can fix, she added. Tom followed her gaze. Yeah, he said. It does. There was a pause. Then she looked at him again, more thoughtful now. I think I've been approaching everything lately like it either has to be completely solved or not started at all, she said. That's a high bar, Tom said. It is, she agreed. And not very realistic. No, he said. Most things land somewhere in the middle. She nodded slowly. Like this, she said, gesturing to the garden. It's not what it was, but it's not beyond repair either. Exactly. She shifted slightly, sitting back more comfortably, her gaze lingering on the work they'd done. I think I know what I'm going to do about my job, she said. Tom looked at her, attentive but not pressing. Okay. I'm going to go back, she said. But not the way I did before. He raised an eyebrow slightly. Meaning I'm going to treat it like part of my life, she said, choosing her words carefully. Not the central piece that everything else has to adjust around. Tom considered that. That's a shift, he said. It is, she agreed. But I think it's the right one. For me. And logistically? He asked. Does that mean staying there? Coming back here? She exhaled slowly. I don't know yet, she admitted. I'm going to have to figure that out with my job. Not just assume the answer. That seems reasonable. And I don't want to make that decision in isolation again, she added, meeting his gaze. Tom held it, understanding the weight of what she meant. Good, he said. Because I don't want that either. That settled something between them, not completely, not definitively, but enough. She looked back at the garden, then reached for another section. Help me with this one, she said. Tom shifted closer. Are you asking or assigning? He asked. Both. I can work with that. They leaned in together, shoulders brushing briefly before settling into a shared space that felt less tentative than before. You know, she said after a moment, this feels different. The garden. She shook her head. No, she said. This. Tom didn't look up immediately, his hands still working carefully through the stems. Different how? He asked. Less fragile, she said. Last time, everything felt like it could break if we moved too quickly or said the wrong thing. He nodded slightly. That's true. And now, she continued, it feels like we can actually adjust without everything falling apart. Tom paused, considering that, then glanced at her. Maybe that's because we're not trying to make it perfect, he said. She smiled faintly. That would be new. Very new. She pulled a stray piece free, setting it aside. I think it's better this way, she said. Yeah, Tom agreed. Me too. They worked a little longer, the section slowly taking shape. No longer overrun, not yet polished, but clearly intentional again. When they finally stood, stretching slightly, she looked at what they'd done with quiet satisfaction. It's a start, she said. It is, Tom agreed. She brushed her hands together, then glanced at him, something softer in her expression now, but steady. We're doing this differently, she said. Yeah, he said. On purpose. Definitely on purpose. There was a brief pause, then she smiled. Not tentative, not uncertain, but sure in a way that hadn't been there before. Good, she said. Tom returned the smile, something equally grounded settling into place. Good, he echoed. And for the first time, neither of them felt like they were waiting for things to go wrong. They were simply building something, one section at a time. Chapter 8, the right time. Finally, the garden no longer looked abandoned. It wasn't perfect, far from it. The rows were still uneven in places, the borders not entirely reclaimed, and a few stubborn stems leaned outward as though reluctant to accept new structure. But it was undeniably cared for again. Intentional. Tom stood at the edge of it late that afternoon, hands resting loosely on his hips, taking in the progress with quiet satisfaction. It's starting to look like something he'd recognize, he said. Beside him, she wiped her hands on a rag, glancing over the same space. He'd still find something wrong with it, she replied. Absolutely, Tom agreed. He'd probably question our time management strategy. She smiled faintly. He never trusted moderation. He didn't believe in it. They stood there for a moment, the warmth of the day settling gently around them. The air carried that faint, familiar scent, earth and herbs and something clean underneath it all. Felt settled. Not finished, but at ease with what it was becoming. She stepped a little further into the garden, crouching briefly to adjust a plant that leaned too far into its neighbor's space. I talked to my manager this morning, she said, not looking up. Tom glanced toward her, attentive. And I told them I'm not relocating permanently, she said. At least, not the way we had planned. Tom nodded once, giving her space to continue. They were surprisingly flexible, she added. More than I expected. That's good, he said. It is, she agreed. I think I assumed that if I didn't commit completely, I'd lose the opportunity. And you didn't, Tom said. No, she said. Turns out there was more room than I gave it. Tom tilted his head slightly. There usually is, he said. We just don't always look for it. She stood again, brushing her hands off, her expression thoughtful but lighter than it had been in days. I'm going to split my time, she continued. Travel when I need to, work remotely when I don't. That sounds like an actual balance, Tom said. That's the goal. She stepped closer to where he stood, her gaze settling on him with quiet steadiness. I should have asked for something like this before, she admitted. Instead of assuming it had to be all or nothing. Tom gave a small shrug. We all learn that lesson eventually, he said. Some of us just take longer. She smiled faintly. I definitely took longer. You got there, he said. That counts. It does. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was reflective but also forward-facing, no longer focused on what had been lost, but on what was possible now. She leaned lightly against the wooden frame of the garden bed, her eyes drifting across the rows. You know what's strange? She said after a moment. What? Tom asked. This doesn't feel like starting over, she said. It feels like picking something back up, but differently. Tom considered that. Yeah, he said. That sounds right. It's not the same, she added. And I don't want it to be. Good, he said. Because it won't be. She looked at him again. No, she said. It won't. There was something in that acknowledgement. Something grounded, unhurried, and entirely deliberate. Not a return. A continuation. Tom shifted slightly closer, the movement small but intentional. We've got more information this time, he said. She raised an eyebrow. That's a very analytical way to look at it. I'm not wrong. You're not, she admitted. We know what doesn't work. And what might, he added. She nodded. And we're not pretending those things don't matter anymore. That helps. It really does. They stood close now, not by accident but not forcing the space either. The ease between them had grown into something steadier, less reactive, more chosen. Are you staying? He asked after a moment. The question simple but weighted. She met his gaze without hesitation. Yes, she said. I am. There was no uncertainty in it. No qualifiers, no hesitation. Just a decision. Tom exhaled slightly. Something quiet and relieved settling beneath the surface. Good, he said. Good, she echoed. A light breeze moved through the garden, stirring the leaves in uneven patterns, creating that soft, shifting sound that had always filled the space when her father was out there, tending to each row with careful attention. She glanced down briefly, reaching out to brush her fingers across one of the plants. He would have liked that we didn't rush this, she said. Tom followed her gaze. Yeah, he said. He would have had opinions, but he would have liked it. He always said timing wasn't something you could force. Tom smiled faintly. He also said it was regret with better marketing. She laughed quietly. He said that too. They stood in that moment, the shared memory settling easily between them. Not heavy, not sad, but present in a way that felt complete. I don't regret it, she said after a while. Tom looked at her. Any of it, she clarified. Not the decision we made before. Not where it led. Not how we ended up here. He considered that, then nodded. Me neither, he said, because it was true. Everything that had happened, the distance, the ending, the time apart, had not erased what they had. It had shaped it, refined it, given it context they hadn't understood before. And now, standing here, there was no sense of something unfinished pulling at them. Only something beginning again with intention. She straightened slightly, glancing around the garden once more. There's still more to do, she said. Tom nodded. There always is. She looked back at him, a quiet smile settling in. Tomorrow? She asked. Tom returned the smile, something steady and certain in it. Tomorrow. It wasn't a promise built on urgency. It wasn't driven by fear of losing the moment. It was simple, practical, chosen. And as they turned together toward the house, leaving the garden behind for the day but not for good, there was no question lingering between them. Not about what this was. Not about whether they should try. Only the understanding that this time, the timing wasn't something working against them. It was something they were finally ready for. Together.